Web browser security, you can really look at this in terms of three big categories. You got pop-ups, you got cookies, and then you got web application security. Pop-ups are starting to become a thing of the past. They're not dead, but they're starting to become something that we just don't deal with as much, and that's because of the built-in features in the web browsers, like to disable pop-ups, or we used to buy pop-up blockers back in the day. All right, so let's talk about cookies. Basically, cookies make your web browsing experience easier. And the reason why I say it like that is because if you wonder how good your web browser experience is, disable cookies or set them to prompt, and you'll find out how much goes on really in the background. And these cookies take care of a lot of that for you. So some of the vulnerabilities with cookies would be things like tracking user behavior, getting an idea of sites that people go to, and in some cases, even storing usernames and passwords. Therefore, privacy could be compromised, because if someone can get access to temporary internet files from across the network, they could essentially get a password. So some of the safeguards here, you could set cookies to disable. I would advise that you don't do that. But I would say at minimum you need to prompt them, and that will certainly entertain your web browsing experience. If you don't have to, don't use them, or certainly don't be storing your usernames and passwords. And I'd have to say the best option here would be to use something like secure socket layer or transport level security. This is going to be huge because essentially there's no eavesdropping, there's no privacy that is exposed. It essentially looks like a credit card transaction for all intents and purposes. And those are the key factors of cookies. Next, let's talk about web application securities. This is really the programming code here, and we're going to go through each one of these right quick. You got JavaScript. Some of the vulnerabilities of JavaScript would be like web-based monitoring. And if you want to see more on this, you can go to CERT-based website, CERT website, or Computer Emergency Response Team websites, and you can get advisories that have been published about JavaScript, and really you just update yourself to the latest and greatest, or trust the site, and that will certainly get you a lot farther. Another thing you can do is change your browser preferences, and there's some options in the advanced tab, tools, account options in there. You'll see that you can disable JavaScript or ActiveX or any of the others really. Definitely some features there you're going to want to look at. All right, ActiveX. Some of the vulnerabilities of ActiveX are unsigned applets. Now, the way you want to approach this is a signed applet means that you're using a digital certificate to sign the applet saying that it has been proven to be trusted. That doesn't mean that you can't run into problems with signed applets. That just means that it has been tested and someone is saying that it's trustable. So the vulnerability is unsigned applets. The countermeasure or safeguard would be to use signed applets whenever possible. Java is all in itself here, all by itself in a category, and you can disable web enhancing features like Java through the advanced options in, like, for example, Internet Explorer. Then you got Common Gateway Interface. This is really server-side programming here. Some of the vulnerabilities include like admin privileges, and if you wanted to add safeguards, you could use things like intrusion detection systems. You could just write your code correctly or securely from the get-go, and that will protect the server. You could validate pre-written scripts. And then certainly use different user groups. Essentially, the big picture of CGI is that you're going to fill out a form on a website, you're going to hit submit, it's going to get submitted to the server is going to process it, and based on your input, it's going to give you the next step of the process. So definitely an easy way to look at this is during checkout. You normally have checkout in 3-4 processes. You check your payment, you check your shipping, but each time you input something, it gets sent to the server processes, and the page that gets returned to you is based on the previous input that you just selected. All right. Well, which brings up the next thing, which is input validation. During that example, if I'm trying to check out an e-commerce transaction, I might actually submit something like change the quantity or the the price and try to negate the value so that essentially I get to buy something for free. Now, it doesn't really work too much anymore, but that describes input validation. If you don't validate your input, then it can be subject to change as it gets processed by the server. Also, things that work with input validation are cross-site scripting, and this is where an attacker is stealing data and then forwarding it to another attacker or another server. And these will also come in the conversation of URL redirects. Then you got buffer overflow attacks, SQL injection, and form validation. And these are really closely integrated here. When you do a buffer overflow, basically I'm sending code to a server that the server can't process, therefore overloading the buffers and crashing it. One attack specifically is a SQL injection, where I tried to inject SQL code, like for example the shutdown command. And you would process a request to a server, the server would get that shutdown request and go, okay, and then just shut itself down. You can prevent this stuff by doing form validation. In other words, you're going to verify that if it's a social security number, that you actually have the exact format as the social security number. In other words, I can't have a social security number of 256 characters or above. And that goes for birth dates, passwords, etc., etc., etc. The easiest way to prevent these types of attacks is really just to disable the scripts. But that certainly will limit the functionality at the same time. So that's about it for browser security. Again, summarize that: pop-ups, cookies, web application security. And then we'll go on to social engineering threats. Okay? Social engineering, if you heard of shoulder surfing yet, this is where you're standing over someone's shoulder and you're looking either at the keys that they're typing on their keyboard, maybe it's the pin that they've entered at an access control point or something like that. You're really just looking over their shoulder, and therefore whatever they're doing is not confidential. Believe me, folks, dumpster diving is still a threat today, just like it was 10, 20 years ago. And people look for things like internal phone directories, organizational charts, policy manuals, calendars, any sort of outdated hardware, system manuals, you name it. That if it gives clues to how your network works, it can be used and definitely valuable to someone doing the dumpster diving. You've got online attacks, right? It's still social engineering. I might send you an email and say, hey, can you open this? I had a problem. Meanwhile, you opened it and it said, yeah, it ran fine. But what I've just done is I've just installed some software, Trojan horse, on your program, and I rely on human ignorance to really carry out that type of social engineering attack. So some of the things, I tell you, your biggest bang for buck here for social engineering countermeasures is going to be training and awareness. Get people up to speed. People are just not trained on how to look at URLs, how to identify a phishing site, and it really, what needs to happen is people just need to be up to speed. Most businesses are good at this by including it in their annual security awareness training, but annually is just not good enough these days. And lastly, we got phishing. Users need to know how to identify the clues of a phishing attack. For example, the whole Bank of America or eBay or PayPal, the types of people that are targeted, banks. Things like looking at the URL or verifying the source code. Some other countermeasures here would be the phishing filter that's available in Internet Explorer. Or it could be from an advisory published from a trusted antivirus site. That's also, a great way to countermeasure things. And lastly, we'll talk about domain kiting. Keywords, folks. Domain kiting is postponing the payment of domain names, where domain tasting is essentially changing domain names to avoid actually paying for the domain name. But the reality is these domain names are cheap enough these days, but when you're conducting an attack, you want no permanent association with them, so you just want to keep switching your domain name and keep jumping the domain names to keep your attack out there longer. And that's it. That's really the summary here of the Introduction to Security Plus Mitigating Threats. I hope you enjoyed it. You can always find out more information and register for free at theconeoflearning.com. And feel free to check out some of our other videos that we have here. We're going to be giving away a lot of the inside secrets on Security Plus and CISSP, but we'd love to have you involved. So go register at